His name is James Reese Europe. His family moved to Washington, D.C., and then eventually he wound up in New York City in 1904. This is where it starts getting interesting. In 1914, the citizens of Harlem, they petitioned the governor of New York State to grant them their own military unit to be based in Harlem. They hired James Reese Europe. He got the rank of lieutenant, and he created an ensemble. And this group, what they did, which is really important, was they created a new sound. This gentleman here, Rafael Hernandez, one of the most important composers of music from Puerto Rico, well, he happens to be, he was a trombonist. And what happened was James Reese Europe was ordered by his superiors in the United States Army to go to Puerto Rico and recruit dark-skinned musicians to join his military outfit. Musicians in places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Panama, etc., were known for their excellent musical training.
In the early months of U.S. participation in World War I in 1917, African-American composer and bandleader James Reese Europe traveled to Puerto Rico. He went to recruit musicians to play in a band attached to the 369th Infantry Hellfighters Band of the New York National Guard, an all-black unit. The regiment's white commanding officer, Colonel William Hayward, wanted to organize the best damn brass band in the United States Army. In order to raise the reputation of African-American soldiers, to convince the Army to deploy them in combat, and perhaps to end segregation in the military altogether, Hayward hired Europe to organize his dream band because of the musician's many previous successes as an artist and entrepreneur. Europe had staged the first concert ever by a black orchestra in Carnegie Hall, and he secured the first recording contract given to an African-American ensemble. 20. He organized other musicians to form mutual benefit societies, and his society orchestra introduced the foxtrot to U.S. audiences by providing accompaniment and choreography for the popular white British dance team of Vernon and Irene Castle. James Reese Europe could not persuade enough New York musicians to give up their lucrative careers to join the Army, so he convinced Hayward to let him recruit black musicians elsewhere. William Hayward, a white colonel in the Nebraska National Guard, had been appointed to shape black patriotism into action by organizing the 15th Heavy Foot Infantry Regiment, colored, of the New York National Guard in June 1916. Its eventual fame as the Harlem Hellfighters, the most decorated American fighting unit in the American Expeditionary Force, belies its meager, indeed shameful, beginnings. Racial opposition arose from the highest military authorities over arming black men to fight Germans or giving black units even the barest essentials for military training. The 15th began its existence with one white officer and little else. No rifles, ammunition, uniforms, armory to drill in, headquarters for recruitment, or troops. There was also little willingness in either the regular Army or the National Guard quartermaster departments to assist Hayward in getting what he needed to get started. Despite Dubois' appeal to patriotism, enlistments were slow among Harlemites in 1917. The call to arms attracted fewer potential recruits than the call to better-paying jobs in defense work. Showmanship, Colonel Hayward thought, might encourage enlistments where parades in Central Park failed. He called on Egbert E. Thompson, brass section director of the Clef Club Orchestra, to provide music for several parades and organize concerts, but Thompson's efforts made little progress. Since few musicians had enlisted in the 15th, Hayward convinced Thompson to recruit musicians for the specific purpose of organizing a permanent regimental band. But Thompson did not reach even this seemingly modest goal. Few of the better musicians, the ones who could most easily make the transition from playing in dance orchestras to performing in a military band concert and marching band, could afford to give up their evenings and the high salaries they earned for regular Army pay. Hayward then turned to James Reese Europe, known as the most famous orchestra leader in the city. Europe had passed the officer's examination and was scheduled to be commissioned as a first lieutenant and given command of one of the regiment's machine gun companies. When Colonel Hayward summoned him, it was not Europe's advice he sought. He commanded Europe to organize for me the best damn band in the United States Army.
Well, he says, no, we got to do something about that. So he organizes something called the Clef Club, 1910. And in it, it's basically a place where you call up and you can hire musicians. And he puts the rules in place. You got to pay people. They got to go dressed, they got to go professional, etc. So he's the guy who kind of, U.B. Blake called him the Martin Luther King of music. Oh, yeah, I love that U.B. says that. I don't know what Martin would feel, but anyway. So in 1912, though, he's met a guy named David Manis, and there's this progressive element happening here. David Manis, you know, Manis School, but David Manis had been taught, he was a poor kid, he's a Polish background, he grew up in New York, and he had learned the violin from an African-American named John Douglas. The person who was a famous composer and performer. And so he wanted to honor that. And he said, let's start a music school in Harlem, Colored Music Settlement School. And he goes to James Reese Europe and says, can your Clef Club musicians play for this? And he says, yeah, where are we going to do it? Let's go to Carnegie Hall. And so it's the first time that we have African-American music at Carnegie Hall. It was a big, big hit. It was really incredible. It changed. It was the first time Carnegie Hall heard this different music. Remember, Carnegie Hall is traditional. And all that, so he organized the Clef Club. And I'm going to skip ahead again to he works with a group he organizes something called the Frogs, which was a professional organization of African-American performers to really uplift. They bought a clubhouse, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're getting to World War I. World War I comes along, and there's this guy named Colonel William Hayward, this white man, and they want to have a regiment of black soldiers in Harlem. The problem is, the 15th Regiment, they're like, no, this is not happening. I don't want to join that. I'm not interested. So what happens is he comes to Jim Europe and says, will you create a band? And Jim Europe said, no, because that's stupid. The regimental bands only had 24 musicians. I need 60. And I can't get the right kind of musicians, and my guys are making a lot of money now. They're playing for the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys, all these. Why would they come and do this? And so he says, well, what could I do to make it? He said, well, give me a large band. Give me $10,000.
James Reese Europe, a member of the group, organized the Clef Club in 1910, essentially a black musicians' union. This was the source of contact for dance orchestras of from 3 to 30 men for any occasion. In May of 1912, Europe's Clef Club orchestra of 145 black men gave a concert at Carnegie Hall. Several years later, one white member of the audience recalled the event and favorably reported her and the audience's reaction in the Musical Quarterly. Music-loving Manhattan felt a thrill down its spine such as only the greatest performances can inspire. There were many violins, violas, cellos, and double basses, but it was a motley group of plectrum instruments of all sorts and sizes: mandolins, guitars, banjos, and a few ukuleles. Then there was an indiscriminate assortment of reed and wind instruments. There were drums and tambourines, big and little, whose sharp accents danced across the jagged syncopations of the music, recalling the elaborate drum orchestras of Africa. There was an inspired timpanist. There was a huge bass drum, Curtis Berlin, black singers and players. October 1919, pp. 501 to 594. Other unique features were the 10 upright pianos in 5 pairs and the singing as they played, string and percussion members. The man playing the bass drum and cymbals might well have been singing a high falsetto, while a first violin player sang a second bass. Despite reminders of elaborate drum orchestras of Africa, this group was distinctly American. Artistic credibility for a new-sounding instrumental organization, the jazz orchestra was in its infancy.
Used to copy most of the things there are originals, but the thing about James Reese Europe, not only was he a composer, a musician, arranger, but he also, as Jason mentioned, was the first African American to actually play Carnegie Hall. And he actually played it with his 125-piece orchestra in 1912, 1913, and 1914. So you can imagine what that might have been at the time, because realized that America was only X years out of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal as the standard. So to have an African American band being invited to play at Carnegie Hall and to do such a phenomenal job, that's his orchestra at Carnegie Hall. Now, Jason often says that prior to the war, James Reese Europe was a string man. And this is a banjoline. I had never seen a banjoline original. I've seen it in the pictures, but a banjoline is actually a hybrid between a banjo and a mandolin. It was popularized by James Reese Europe, and as you see, he actually had about 35 members playing banjolines. That banjoline is from 1910, so that would be circa to the era. And to me, again, it was his creativity in terms of combining a banjo, which has its southern origins, and a mandolin. Because realize at the time, pre-jazz, the music of the day was mostly minuets, mostly waltzes, mostly things coming over from Europe. And obviously the dominant instruments and strings were the violins and the mandolins. So what he wound up doing was using...
The Castles were a sensation. But much of their success was due to the all-black orchestra which traveled with them everywhere, and to its remarkable leader, James Reese Europe. Europe was a clergyman's son who was raised in Washington, D.C., where he squeezed violin and piano lessons in between the odd jobs he worked to help support his family after his father died. Europe's career took off fast. By the time he was 23, he was the musical director for black shows that had become the latest fashion on Broadway. And well before he met the Castles, he was the preeminent society orchestra leader in New York, playing for the Astors and the Vanderbilts.
The Europe gang were absolute reading sharks. They could read a moving snake, and if a fly lit on that paper, he got played. But the people wanted to believe that Negroes couldn't learn to read music but had a natural talent for it. So we never played with no music. I'd get all the latest Broadway music from the publisher, and we'd learn the tunes and rehearse them until we had them all down pat. Never made no mistakes. All the high-toned, big-time folks would say, "Isn't it wonderful how these untrained, primitive musicians can pick up all the latest songs instantly without being able to read music?" U.B. Blake.
James Reese Europe was not content just to play ragtime. He wanted more. He was convinced that it was his duty to reveal to the world what he called the musical proficiency of the African race. By working with the Castles, Europe saw his chance to bring his orchestrated version of African American music to a far wider audience.
We had a club here in New York called the famous Clef Club, where all the guys were thorough musicians. In order to join it, you had to not only be a great musician, your discipline had to be 100%, your character 100%, because we played for all the rich people, the classic people.
In 1910, a Broadway orchestra director named James Reese Europe formed the Clef Club, a booking agency and union for black musicians. From the cabarets to the concert halls, Europe's orchestras dominated the New York music scene and won new levels of respect and popularity for black musicians.
You have to recognize that the musicians that were in that group all came under the influence of James Reese Europe. This was all a part of what Willie the Lion heard, and he could see around him with the people from the various groups that were put together by James Reese Europe, that there was a melodic strain that he could tap into.
Willie called it beautification, the merging of light classical melodic and harmonic strains with the rhythmic pulse of stride. In this early sound film, Clef Club member Eubie Blake beautified a familiar tune.
When Willie was showing me music or playing, he mainly talked about how you should beautify a piece, how you should make it refined, and you should not bang on the piano, and you should use dynamics. The classical influence dispels the myth that these people were semi-literate or illiterate bums working in bars, and they didn't have any understanding of music outside purely instinctive means of performance. These people were sophisticated and were aware of harmony and counterpoint, musical structure.
Eubie told me that the fellas in Jim Europe's band could read the spots on the snake's ass. They were so good at sight reading.
Blake also remembered that in the Clef Club orchestras, they sometimes had to hide the music to avoid disappointing white audiences who thought that the black musicians played by ear and couldn't read music.
Colonel Hayward understood from the first that successful recruiting depended in large part on showmanship, and that meant parades and uniforms, and the stirring music of a military brass band. Weekly drills by men in civilian clothes with broomsticks in the Lafayette Theater or in Central Park in silence would not attract many recruits. On October 1st, therefore, as soon as he thought it feasible, Hayward arranged for the 607 officers and men of the 15th New York Infantry, plus a few extras, notably Burt Williams, to parade down Fifth Avenue to the Union League Club where Governor Whitman officially presented the regiment with its colors. Music for the parade was supplied by Clef Club member E. Thompson and his band, which Hayward was forced to hire since few musicians had yet enlisted in the 15th. The band performed well enough, and Hayward convinced Thompson to try to organize and recruit a permanent regimental band. 2 months later, despite his best efforts and several public concerts by the 15th Infantry Band, Thompson had been unable to make much progress. The major problem was that few of the better musicians, the ones who could most easily make the transition from playing in dance orchestras to performing in a military concert and marching band, could afford to give up their evenings and the high salaries they earned for regular army pay. In addition, black brass and woodwind players were already at a premium for commercial jobs since there were far fewer of them than pianists and string players in New York at the time. Colonel Hayward was concerned both with Thompson's inability to recruit musicians as well as with the slow rate of enlistment in the regiment in general, and he believed the two were related. The only other black National Guard regiment, the 8th Illinois, had a concert band that had achieved an enviable reputation, and Hayward thought that it was one of the main reasons why the 8th Regiment had been given better equipment and a proper armory to drill in. In early December, therefore, Hayward called Jim Europe, whom he knew to be the most famous orchestra leader in the city, to his office to discuss the problem. Europe had by this time passed the officer's examination and was scheduled to be commissioned as a first lieutenant and given command of one of the regiment's machine gun companies. Since Army band leaders were non-commissioned officers, he had no reason to expect that Hayward wanted anything more from him than advice. The colonel, however, wanted something more than that. He wanted Jim Europe to organize the best band in the U.S. Army. Prior to accepting his new assignment with the 15th Regiment, among other ongoing professional commitments, Europe had been engaged by the Royal Poinciana Hotel to provide 2 dance orchestras to the Palm Beach Resort during January and February 1917. This was an important, high-paying job for tempo club musicians, requiring that Europe personally be away from New York for most of that period. Sissel, who had performed at the Royal Poinciana the previous season, had anticipated accompanying Europe to Florida, but Europe asked him to remain in New York to begin implementing his plans for organizing the band. Europe realized that there would be little time for training his musicians, and that he, therefore, needed to recruit already skilled instrumentalists. As Colonel Hayward recalled their conversation about the difficulty, Europe told him that reed instruments, that is, clarinets, flutes, saxophones, and one or two other instruments, served the same purpose in a military band that string instruments serve in a symphony orchestra, and he said there was a great scarcity of reed instrument players in the United States among the colored people. Hayward asked what the answer was, and Europe, to his astonishment, replied that it was Puerto Rico. It is not clear how Europe first came to know about the strong band tradition among Puerto Rican musicians, especially those of African descent. Prior to World War I, immigration from Puerto Rico had not been large, despite its becoming a possession of the United States in 1898, and no sizable Puerto Rican community had yet developed in New York City. Judging from the lack of Spanish surnames among the members of the Clef Club and Tempo Club, the number of Afro-Puerto Ricans who had become part of the black entertainment profession in the city must also have been small. On the island, however, with the abolition of slavery in 1873 and the decline of the sugar industry, black and mulatto Puerto Ricans had begun migrating to the larger towns where popular musical performance became one means for many of them to attain some measure of respectability. Many of these musicians were reed players, and by the early spring of 1917, Europe had heard of them and was sufficiently sure of his information that he proposed to Colonel Hayward that he be sent to San Juan as soon as he returned from Florida to recruit woodwind players for the band. Hayward agreed. Exactly how Reese Europe ascertains that Puerto Rico could supply good musicians is open to speculation. Ruth Glasser suggests that it is possible that Europe knew about the musicians because they had already been discovered by North Americans previously. The first recordings of the music from the island date back to 1910. At the beginning of 1917, representatives of the Victor Talking Machine Company had stopped in San Juan as part of a recording tour through Latin America. Several numbers by both Manuel Teisel's bands were recorded. These 1917 recordings probably were the first to capture the sound of Juan Teisel's trombone. Jim Europe himself had been recording for Victor since 1914 or earlier and had established relationships with company personnel. Glasser goes on to say that James Reese Europe found that Puerto Rico was a mecca for musicians. This recruitment brought about a significant encounter between two groups whose histories had telling differences as well as striking intersections and similarities. African Americans and Puerto Rican musicians in the context of World War I and their interactions in the ensuing decades were conditioned by these parallels, overlaps, and differences. Indeed, the careers of recruiter and recruited, the basis upon which the Puerto Rican trip was initiated and the band formed, tell us a great deal about the two groups and the worlds they came from. Another notable Puerto Rican who served in a black unit was Rafael Hernandez, composer of some of the most beloved popular ballads and dance tunes in Puerto Rico and Latin America. The celebrated African-American jazz band leader James Reese Europe recruited Rafael along with his brother Jesus and 16 other Puerto Rican musicians of African or mixed ancestry to serve as members of the 369th Infantry Regiment Band. This unit, formerly known as the 15th Infantry Regiment, New York National Guard, saw combat in the Western Front as part of the French 6th Army and was nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters. The sounds of jazz caused a great impact in post-war European culture, especially in Paris, which became a haven for jazz musicians in the following decades. Hernandez and his fellow Puerto Ricans adopted some of the rich harmonic language of early jazz to the rhythms and melodies of their own musical tradition to create a distinctive Afro-Caribbean Latin musical style which had enormous impact throughout Latin America. In the 1930s, Rafael Hernandez made his way for an extended stay in Mexico where he married a second time and started a family. He achieved substantial recognition as a composer and/or band leader in Mexico, where he also hosted radio programs and appeared in feature films. In August and September of 1939, Hernandez made a brief trip to serve as director of the Alfredo Brito Orchestra in Havana that recorded a number of tunes, almost all authored by him. In October of the same year, he also returned to New York and recorded at least 4 of his compositions. After many years in both the United States and Mexico, he returned to his homeland. Hernandez was incredibly versatile. In fact, Rafael Hernandez is considered Puerto Rico's greatest composer of popular music, and his compositions reflect his varied musical experiences. His early experiences with the Hellfighters and the jazz venues of Harlem became part of his foundation that led to his incomparable career in music. Many of his compositions and arrangements, such as El Combanchero and Cachita, reflect how he was influenced by the big band sound that was typical of the jazz bands.